Hello and welcome to another weekly meta review. Every week I cover the best decks in best of 3, best of 1, and every once in a while a budget deck. And this week we don't have any budget decks other than the mono blue that I've covered in the weeks past. I highly recommend that one. I'm going to be taking a quick little break from creating some Magic the Gathering content just for a week or two. I will be back for the Outlaws at Thunder Junction in April, and meanwhile I'll try to entertain you guys with some of my trophying drafts from Murders at Karlov Manor. I know this is standard, so it's a little bit of cross content there, but I do enjoy doing both. But enough of that, and let's get into the best decks this week. So the way that I like to do this is I like to look at the standard challenge tournaments on Magic the Gathering Online. They are very competitive and a large player pool. And we see some good diversity in the top 3 decks each week. So this week, first place was taken down by Golgari Midrange by Sokos 13. And if we compare this one to week 5 of Murders at Karlov Manor, so last week, we can see that they have decided to drop 1 Tranquil Frillback and bring in 1 Gix's Command in the main. And then for the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 1 cut down, brought in an additional copy of Duress for against the Azorius Control matchups. We're ditching the Nightclubber as well as the Anoint with Affliction and Pilfer and the End and Unlicensed Hearse, and bringing in Tear Asunder, which allows you to exile an artifact or enchantment or kick it to exile target non-land permanent instead. And we're bringing in 1 copy of Liliana of the Veil. To attack their hand. And then we've also got 1 copy of Sorin the Mirthless and 2 copies of the Cruelty of Gix. So if you're kind of curious about the cards and what matchups they're good for in the sideboard, last Friday I covered Golgari Midrange won the vote for the best of 3 sideboard. So if you want to check that one out, that one kind of goes over the specific matchups for everything, and you can kind of see some of the alternatives like Tear Asunder and Long Goodbye made it into the list here, and like Path of Peril or against the Boros Convoke. But on to the next one. Second place was taken down by Azorius Control by Jabberwocky. And if we compare this one to week 3 of Murders at Karlov Manor, we can see that we've ditched the 2 Hornblock Whales, brought in 3 more copies of Deduce for a little bit of card advantage, brought in 1 Disruption Protocol, which works with the map tokens off of your Restless Anchorage, as well as the clue tokens from Deduce, for just a straight-up counterspell. Brought in 1 copy of Get Lost, and ditched the 2 copies of Urtai's Scorn, which was particularly good against the double spelling in Boros Convoke, and brought in a Confounding Riddle, which allows us to counter, but also allows us to kind of have like a miniature Memory Deluge. So this one has flexible options. We've also brought in 3 copies of Depopulate, so leaning quite heavily on the Wraths, Sunfall, Farewell, Depopulate, and 1 copy of Temporary Lockdown. So we're ditching the 3 copies of Quick Study. Dropping the lockdowns were at 4, dropping them all the way down to 1, I think is kind of motioning that maybe Boros Convoke is not as it may be dropping in popularity. We've seen it make it into the top 3 once. And it definitely was prevalent there. For a second there, it overtook Esper Midrange as the most popular within the Magic the Gathering tournaments on MTG Goldfish. So I think they were kind of expecting more Azorius Control matchups, and we've seen a rise in Azorius Control's popularity, where Temporary Lockdown is kind of a dead card. Not entirely dead, but like not great. As far as the lands go, we've got down 2 copies of A Darker Waste, down 1 copy of Field of Ruin. So we're running only 3 instead of 4. And then we're bringing in an island, Mirix. So 1 copy here against the other Azorius Control. This also points to their anticipating there being more Azorius Control matchups. Bringing in 1 Plains and bringing the Restless Anchorage up to a total of 4. So dropping the 2 Seachrome Coasts, which are the Azorius Fastlands, and then bringing in 2 copies of the Sunken Citadel, which helps us activate the ability of land sources for our Restless Anchorages. So total of 28 lands instead of 27. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got 2 copies of Elspeth's Smite that we're bringing in. We've got 1 copy of Get Lost in the sideboard, as well as bringing in 2 copies of Negate and 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse. This one is particularly good against the graveyard landfall deck, like the Sultai one that took down the Chicago Standard Tournament. And we've seen some people bringing in Unlicensed Hearse while others have been letting go of it. And then ditching the knockout blows, ditching 2 knockout blows down to a total of 2. Ditching 2 copies of the Sunset Revelry, so not anticipating much on the mono red side, which is a difficult matchup for this deck. So not heavily teching against that. And then we've dropped the 2 Disdainful Strokes, which I like. So if you go back and you look at my sideboard guide for Azorius Control, you'll notice that I talk a lot about negates and their advantages over the Disdainful Strokes. The Disdainful Stroke does allow you to hit the Knight Errant of Eos, because it can counter creature spells that cost 5 or more. So this is there's a couple signs here that it's this specific build is worse against the Boros Convoke matchup. And then we've also cut 1 copy of Farewell in the sideboard. Third place was taken down by Esper Midrange by Kadrip. And if we compare this one to the week 5 list from last week, we can see that nothing has changed in the main. The only changes that have occurred have been in the best of 3 sideboard. So the sideboard changes here are also very not very much. So we've brought in 1 copy of Destroy Evil, which works particularly well against the other Esper Midrange matchups because it hits the Wedding Announcements, Virtue of Loyalty, as well as Rafine. And then we're ditching 1 copy of Negate. So instead of 3 copies, we're only running 2. And then bringing in 1 additional copy of Tishana's Tidebinder. The previous list was only running 1. And this one's, is particularly good against Azorius Control. So I think instead of negating the Planeswalkers, we're going for silencing the Planeswalker. And the upside of doing this is that this has more utility against the Boros Convoke strategies, because it can silence the Knight Errant of Eos as well as the Imidane's Recruiter. So I can get behind that change. And then we're ditching the 1 copy of Lauren of the Third Path, which honestly, it was brought in really to be a Destroy Evil against Esper Midrange. And if you go and look at my Esper Midrange sideboard guide, then you can see that Lauren of the Third Path wasn't really working better than just an additional copy of Destroy Evil. It does work nicely in some matchups where you can afford to draw against your opponent. So I think the best one was against Domain, if I remember correctly. But so yeah, going off of that path, and I can get behind that change as well. All right, and then first place for the Standard Challenge 64 on March 10th was taken down by Dimir Midrange by Fried Liver Attack, which is a great name. And if we compare this one to week 4, we can see they have decided to cut 1 copy of the Fairy Mastermind. This list is not... There's some synergies with the Fairy Mastermind and the Urtai Resurrected. Some lists were deciding to drop the Urtai Resurrected. I digress. The Lasav Wear of Faces. So the one that I covered in week 4 was running Invasion of Amonkhet and like doing some really interesting things, if I remember correctly, where we were trying to out-tempo their plays by copying something with Lasav. So this is not the first time we've seen this, but it was also ditched there momentarily and then brought back in. So, it's being explored as an option in Dimir Midrange. And we are bringing in 4 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, which I really like. I think this card is fantastic. It just the ability to draw cards as well as create the 1/1s that can help you stabilize. I'm a big fan of Preacher of the Schism. We're bringing in Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal in the main. Again, this is another one that if you look at my Dimir sideboard guide for best of 3, kind of see which matchups Acklazot's is good in and which ones it's not. So kind of bringing it into the main, depending on what you're anticipating your matchup to be. And then as far as the spells go, we've ditched 2 copies of Spell Pierce and 3 copies of the Subterranean Schooner, so not running the vehicle. And we're ditching the 3 copies of Cryptic Coat, which is one of the better cards against Azorius Control. And then we're cutting 1 copy of the Gix's Command, which was particularly good against Boros Convoke. and bringing in 4 copies of Make It Disappear. And I like this, you know, the Spell Pierce is okay, but one of the things that's nice about the Dimir Midrange is leaning off of the ability of like the Flash Flyer on Fairy Mastermind so that you can keep up a counterspell and then flash this in if there isn't a good thing to counter. So I kind of like that, but you know, Urtai Resurrected. So I like them. I like the Make Disappears if you're going to be running more of the Flash package. And then as far as the lands go, we've gone up 1 Mirrex and down 1 Shipwreck Marsh. For the best of 3 sideboard guide, for the best of 3 sideboard, we've dropped 1 copy of Duress, so just running 2 instead of 3 for the Azorius Control matchup. Bringing the one of the Spell Pierces that was in the main is now in the sideboard here. If it's a particularly good matchup for the Spell Pierce. I like Spell Pierce a lot against like the Sunfalls. Any of the more expensive board wipes are pretty good targets to be able to hit with a single 1 blue. And sometimes your opponent won't play around it because they usually anticipate like a No More Lies or Make Disappear on 2 instead of 1, right? Disdainful Stroke dropped down from 2 to 1 as well. So this was kind of like an anti-domain tech. And we haven't been seeing that much domain, although we did see a little bit of a spike because Golgari Midrange came back. Acklazotz we've brought out of the sideboard and into the main. And then we've dropped 1 copy of Glistening Deluge, which is kind of the Dimir's response to the Boros Convoke, trying to do a one-sided board wipe. And thank you for the follow. I forgot to turn off my notifications. Oops. Anyway, I lost my place. Okay, yeah. Blot Out. This is one that we haven't seen before, or at least I haven't seen before. Target opponent exiles a creature or a planeswalker that they control with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers that they control. So Blot Out giving you some of that specific hate for expensive things, and kind of like an alternative to maybe Shieldred's Edict that gives you a little bit more selection to hit big things like Acklazotz. Curious about the Blot Out, and excited to see how that one plays out. We've got the Graveyard Trespasser, which we're starting to see a little bit, like a little hint of Graveyard Hate, and Graveyard Trespasser allows us to do that. And then we've also got Liliana the Veil, and this is one that you're going to want to be bringing in specific matchups. Again, I covered the best matchups for each card in my sideboard guides, so if you haven't checked that out already, I can highly recommend it. Second place in the Standard Challenge 64 was taken down by Domain by L1X0. And I just want to point this out. This is the most diverse standard meta that we've ever had. Like, it is so exciting to see 5 different decks in the top 3s of both tournaments. And it's just such a, you know, it's so nice when it's not just all 3 of the same deck, right? So I'm living for standard right now. It's fantastic. And we can see if we compare this one to week 5 that I covered last week, we've ditched 1 copy of the Invasion of Zendikar down to 3 and brought in 1 additional copy of Spelunking. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've brought Kutzil Flanker down 1. I think it's just because we're seeing less of the Sultai Landfall Reanimator strategy. I guess it's not even really a Reanimator strategy, but it's the one with Slogurk, which still hasn't won like a big tournament outside of the one in Chicago as far as Moto is concerned. Partially because like once people are expecting it, they can tech against it relatively easily by bringing in something like Flanker that exiles the entire graveyard. So we've dropped 1 copy of there, not anticipating that matchup as much, and instead we're bringing in the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, which I really like because in the Domain Mirror it often comes down to mill, and so this is a way to kind of take this is a good sideboard to bring in if you're expecting more Domain, which this player apparently was. And then we've ditched 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor. And third place was taken down by El Milan 19, probably destroying your name, sorry. And is another Esper Midrange list, so this week we got 2. And this one does have some changes in the main, so we've got 1 copy of Cutdown, only 2 copies of Cutdown, bringing in 1 copy of Long Goodbye in the main. Usually we see this as an explored sideboard option. And then we're cutting 1 copy of Virtue of Loyalty and bringing in 1 Caves of Kolios. So running an additional land, bringing up the Caves of Kolios to a total of 4. So we have 27 total lands instead of 26. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've dropped 1 duress. So this is kind of just something we've seen across the board, is less duresses. I guess there was one that was running 4, but the other 3 dropped down to 2. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke. Again, this one has pros and cons depending on the matchup. So a total of 3 copies of Disdainful Stroke here over more copies of Duress. They both still work really well against Sunfall. Excuse me. And then Kaido Shizuki. We've seen this one. Excuse me. I've been talking too long. So we're bringing in 2 copies of Kaido Shizuki, and this one is kind of matchup dependent. Again, if you want to see what the best matchups are, I recommend the sideboard guides. Off the top of my head, I kind of remember them being okay at the Boros Convoke in mono red as a way to kind of gain card advantage outside of Gix losing a life, or Dimir. I'm not sure they were in the Esper Midrange deck other than that, right? So the Kaido Shizuki kind of gives you this alternative threat that can help you with card advantage, and yeah, totally described that one perfectly. And then we have Obscura Interceptor here, which is another form of counterspell, but usually we see this in more of a tempo-based strategy. So you can flash it in, and then it connives, and then when it connives, return up to 1 target spell to its owner's hand. So this allows you to bounce some problematic thing and give you an additional turn. Not exactly sure what the best matchup is for the Obscura Interceptor, although we have seen it as a sideboard option kind of come and go throughout the weeks. And then we're making a bunch of cuts, so we're dropping the 1 copy of Lauren of the Third Path, 1 copy of Tishana's Tidebinder, 1 cut down, as well as 1 negate. And don't you worry if best of 1 is your jam, I do cover best of 1 as well. And this week we see a lot of changes occurring in the top 8 performing best of 1 decks according to Untapped, which is a tracker that tracks Magic the Gathering matches and data. So number 1, according to Untapped, with at least 1,000 matches, is Boros Convoke. And compared to the Boros Convoke list, I forgot to write down which week that was, forgive me, but we do see some changes. So we've dropped 2 copies of Lunarch Veteran, and we've brought in 2 copies of the Ocean Frontliner. This one has more synergies with the Gleeful Demolition, and we've dropped 1 copy of the Resolute Reinforcements, as well as 1 Regal Bunnycorn. So no 1 of Regal Bunnycorn. Brought in 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, which is one that I haven't seen in a whole lot of the best of 3 lists. Although, you see them as a sideboard option. And then bringing in 4 copies of the Gateway Express. And so this one, again, if you go and look at my sideboard guide or my Ultimate Nerd Edition to Boros Convoke, either one kind of covers the matchups where Case of the Gateway Express is better against mid-range decks and aggro decks, whereas the War Leader's Call is better against Domain and against Control. So maybe this is a nod to there being a little bit less Azorius Control on the ladder, and hopefully, because I think that one's probably not a crowd favorite to play against. So we're ditching the 3 copies of the War Leader's Call. As far as the lands go, we've got Battlefield Forge is up 1, brought in 1 Mountain, brought in an additional copy of Sokenzan, as well as a Ganjo. So both legendary lands running as a 2 copy. Dropping the Cavern of Souls down to 2, and bringing in 1 copy of Mirix to a total of 2. Notably, no Thran Portal. So giving up on a little bit of the consistency, but then increasing our win rates against like mono red, where the life gain can be detrimental. So I'm not 100% sold either way, honestly, on the lands. I think there's pros and cons to each, but it's very exciting to see a new change to the Boros Convoke list in best of 1. Following shortly on its tail at number 2 is Mono Red Aggro, and this one we've seen this variation before. So we're ditching the 1 copy of Shivan Devastator, which is the dragon that has synergies with Godric and can kind of be played on curve, for 1 more copy of Bloodthirsty Adversary, bringing this one up to a total of 4. Ditching the 3 copies of Charming Scoundrel, which has the Treasure or the Wicked Roll token, which is good for triggering the Celebration of Godric, and instead upping Squee, which can also trigger the Celebration of Godric, ditching 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, and instead bringing in 2 copies of Nahiri's Warcrafting. And the reason why you're bringing this in over the Witchstalker's Frenzy is that because Bloodthirsty Adversary can bring back Nahiri's Warcrafting, because Witchstalker's Frenzy costs 4. So there's more synergies between these 2 cards, and so since we're bringing in this one to 4, kind of makes sense to do the Warcrafting over the Fury, in my mind. And then we're bringing in 2 more copies of Mishra's Foundry, bringing the lands up to a total of 22 versus the 20, and making it, you know, have a little bit more of a mid-range kind of feel, maybe a little bit slower than the previous list. Okay, then number 3 is Celestine Enchantments, which is the same list as I covered in week 2 of Murders at Karlov Manor. It's the one without the Brushlands and without Boseiju and Aganjo, just the cheaper land build was number 3. Number 4 was Orsov Lifegain, which is the one that I covered in week 2, and is the one that I did the 50-match summary on. And then Mono Black Aggro, we see some changes here. It's number 5 according to Untapped. And if we compare this one to the one that I covered in week 3, we can see that we've ditched the 2 copies of the Bilious Skull Dweller, the 1/1 toxic creature, and the 4 copies of the Fairy Dream Thief. Brought in the 4 copies of the Evolved Sleeper, which was an old favorite, and we're dropping 1 copy of the Deep Cavern Bat, dropping the 1 copy of Lord Skitter, dropping 4 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, which I'm a little sad to see, bringing in 2 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse, so up to a total of 4. Really just like hate on mono red. And then we're ditching 1 copy of the Akalazot's Deepest Betrayal and leaning more towards the old classic of the 4 copies of the Phyrexian Flesh Gorger. We've brought in an additional copy of Liliana of the Veil, as well as an additional copy of Gix's Command, which works particularly well against the Boros Convoke strategy, if you can survive to casting it. We're ditching 1 copy of the Shieldred's Edict, and bringing in 1 more copy of Virtue of Persistence, which again, the early removal and life gain of Virtue of Persistence I really like. And then it also then turns into a late game, being able to take a creature from the graveyard onto the battlefield, and if you reanimate Flesh Gorger, it's straight up a 7/5. That's kind of fun. I was waiting to see that, you know, right? Or see that again, I should say. And then we've dropped 1 copy of the Mishra's Foundry, and brought in 3 more copies of Swamps, so running a total of 26 lands instead of 24. And then number 6, according to Untapped, is Azorius Control, and we see changes to this as well. If we compare this one to the week 2 in Murders of Karlov Manor, which is when I went over most of the top performing deck archetypes anyway, so we can see that we brought in 2 more copies of March of Otherworldly Light. This card I really like right now. I think it is really well positioned in Azorius Control because you can use it to remove one of the artifact tokens that's getting targeted by Gleeful Demolition in Boros Convoke, and then you can also use it to remove lands, because lands you can pay this for X = 0 and remove a man land. So this is a really great way, probably better than the Demolition Field and the Field of Ruin, which we're starting to see getting dropped from lists. Largely, I think, because the answer is use March of Otherworldly Light. So bringing that one up to a total of 4. We dropped the 1 copy of Negate, as well as the 4 copies of Soul Partition, and then brought in 1 additional copy of Temporary Lockdown. This is like your best answer against Bant and Boros Convoke. Bant Poison. And then, all right. And then we're we're ditching the 2 copies of the Celestis, and bringing out 2 copies of Sunfall, as well as 1 Farewell, and instead leaning into the Depopulate on 2, which tends to do better against Domain. Some you know, like, depending on how bad the lists are punished by exile compared to just being destroyed, right? So the more that people lean heavily into Depopulate, then the more that people counter by doing Invasion of Gobakon, which needs which gets around the Depopulates. So we're leaning a little bit more into the Depopulate form of the meta right now. And then we've got the 2 copies of Get Lost, 1 copy of Deduce, and 4 copies of Dissipate, which allows you to exile the problematic threats that maybe get around the Depopulate strategy. So you gotta be careful about what you hit with your Dissipates. We're ditching the 4 copies of Jace, which I thought was kind of like, usually that's your win condition against other control matchups. So this one is like going old school and is really just leaning heavily on the Wandering Emperor as well as manlands to finish out the game. But we do see Archangel of Elspeth, which I mentioned in my Azorius Best of 3 guide, if I remember correctly. But Archangel of Elspeth can be really nice because of the lifelink to stabilize against mono red as well as Boros Convoke. So this looks very heavily teched against mono red and Boros Convoke, less so against other Azorius Control matchups. So maybe we are seeing a decrease in Azorius Control on the ladder after all. As far as the lands go, we're up an additional copy of the Darkar Waste to a total of 4. We're down the 4 copies of the Demolition Field as well as the 1 copy of the Field of Ruin. Again, leaning more heavily on the March of Otherworldly Light to take care of the manlands. We've ditched the 2 copies of the islands to bring in 1 Seachrome Coast, the Azorius Fastland, and 1 Gonjo, which wasn't being included in the original, or in the list I covered in week 2. And then also bringing in the 2 copies of Sunken Citadel to synergize with our 4 copies of the Restless Anchorage, as well as Mirix. Bringing in 3 Mirix, so we have a total of 27 lands over 26. And then last but not least, we've got Golgari Midrange coming in at number 8, and we figured that we would see this. Previously, the ones that had over 1,000 matches were all the Insidious Roots decks, which are fun, but they are not, I wouldn't say, highly competitive, right? They're very matchup dependent. How about that? But so we've seen an increase in the tournament scene of the old rock Golgari Midrange with the Glissa Sunslayer. And so I was wondering if we were going to see more of this in Best of 1, and indeed we have. So if we compare this, I'm going to compare it to the week 5 list in Best of 3. I think it's the best way to kind of see where the differences lie. And so in this list for Best of 1, we're bringing in an additional copy of Glissa Sunslayer, so up to 2 instead of just 1. We've ditched the 1 copy of the Preacher of the Schism, so down to 3 from 4. And we're bringing in 1 more copy of Sentinel of the Nameless City. And we're ditching the 3 copies of the Tranquil Frillback. I think that largely has to do with like Reanimator strategies and the Sultai Landfall, and like, you know, there is the Breach deck, right? There's the like Breach on 4 with the 1 triple bit blue. I'm blanking on the name of it. Anyway, you don't come into it that often though. So we're getting rid of the Tranquil Frillbacks. We're bringing in 1 more copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse. You know, Best of 1 has a lot of mono red. Shieldred the Apocalypse is really good against mono red. We're taking out the Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which you tend to see more often in Best of 3 than you do in Best of 1. We're cutting 1 copy of Cutdown and bringing in 2 copies of the Shieldred's Edict. I think this largely reflects the amount of just Azorius Control Planeswalker strategies on the meta. And then bringing in 1 Terra Sunder. We're bringing out 1 Terra... No, yeah, bringing in 1 Terra Sunder. Again, this one allows us to kind of have artifact and enchantment hate. There's a fair amount of enchantment stuff with the Boros Convoke. You can hit the War Leader's Call, the Case of the Gateway Express, and then otherwise you can use this for 4 costs like spot removal and its exiles. Gix's Command we're bringing in as down to 1 copy instead of 2. Again, this one's good for Boros Convoke. And then we've got Virtue of Persistence, which gives us some of that early aggression. You usually see Virtue of Persistence a little bit more in the Best of 1 meta than you do in the Best of 3. Again, because it is good to have against the mono red prevalency in Best of 1. So bringing in 1 copy of Nissa, Ascended Animist. And again, if you go back and you look at the sideboard guide that I covered on Friday, it does apply to Best of 1 as well. You get to learn, what the matchups are good and what cards are good, right? And one of the things that I was suggesting was bringing in a second copy of Nissa Ascended Animist into the main. So I was happy to see that happening here. And then we're cutting 2 forests and bringing in 2 copies of the we're cutting 2 forests as well as the 2 copies of the Underground Mortuary, which are the Surveil land that we got in Murders at Karlov Manor. And instead we're bringing in 2 copies of Mishra's Foundry, and so we're down to 24 lands from 26. And that tends to be something that you see in Best of 1. You usually see a decrease in land count, which is why it was kind of surprising to see the increase in land count on the previous deck. But anyway, that's going to cover it for this week. And if you're new here, welcome to my community. Remember to hit like and subscribe. And if you want to help support me financially, you can join as a YouTube member and get these as soon as Wednesdays is the goal. I'm going to be taking a break though, so I won't be back until April. I'll be back for my draft guide review for the Outlaws at Thunder Junction, and I'll be back to doing these as soon as I'm done with my break. So thanks everybody. Good luck with your matches and your RCQs, and good luck climbing the ladder.